It was in late January 1946, less than a year after the Second World War had come to an end, that in front of thousands of people inside the city of Kiev, that 12 members of the German police force and army were brought out to a large gallows which had been made for their execution. These men were stood under the crossbeam of a gallows, and the executioners then approached them and secured the nooses around their necks. The crimes that these men were involved in resulted in one of the largest massacres in human history, and especially during World War II, which became known as Babi Yar. For the people who witnessed the executions that day inside of the public square, it was some form of justification for the evils of the men who had helped the Nazis to slaughter 33,000 people in 2 deadly days in September 1941. In total, it was thought that at Babi Yar up to 150,000 people were executed during the German occupation. However, what happened with the public executions that day, as thousands of people witnessed their deaths? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Babi Yar is a ravine which became during the Second World War the site of mass slaughter and execution. The Germans, following the launching of Operation Barbarossa, burst into the territory around Kiev, and they would occupy it on the 19th of September 1941. The occupation was ruthless and brutal, but the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had planted many secret bombs and explosives around the capital, and they then detonated them and caused huge damage in the region. Explosions went off close to the German military headquarters, and with this the SS then ruthlessly decided to put the people of the city to the sword, and they targeted Jewish people in retaliation for the bombings. The commanders of the Einsatzgruppe and SS police leader Friedrich Jeckeln carried out the slaughter of thousands, and units commanded by Dr. Otto Rasch of Einsatzgruppe C and Paul Blobel began the roundup of Jews inside of the city. They ordered people to gather in specific places and bring with them their valuables and documents, and also warm clothes and bed linen. They were tricked into believing that they would be deported and resettled elsewhere, but this was not the case. The Germans ordered that any Jewish person not following the order to meet in the square would be shot and executed, and that civilians who entered houses and looted would also be shot. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, over 33,000 Jewish civilians at Babi Yar Ravine were executed. The Einsatzgruppe, the death squads made up of executioners, took command and control. The commander who oversaw the brutality claimed, "The difficulties resulting from such a large-scale action, in particular concerning the seizure, were overcome in Kiev by requesting the Jewish population through wall posters to move. Although only a participation of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 had been expected at first, more than 30,000 Jews arrived who, until the very moment of their execution, still believed in their resettlement, thanks to an extremely clever organisation." One man who was involved in driving the trucks containing victims to the death site claimed that, "I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women and children arrived. They were led past a number of different places, where one after the other they had to give up their luggage, then their coats, shoes and overgarments, and also underwear. They also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing. It all happened very quickly, and anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed by guards to keep moving." Those people who were taken to the ravine had little idea what was happening until they got to the site. They would have heard the fire from the machine guns, which were executing those who had been sent there earlier. They were then ordered to walk down a corridor containing armed German guards, and then in groups of 10 they were collected. It was claimed that, once undressed, they were led into the ravine, which was about 150 metres long and 30 metres wide and a good 15 metres deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of those who had already been shot. The corpses were literally in layers. A police marksman came along and shot each one in the neck with a submachine gun, and I saw marksmen stand on layers of corpses and shoot one after the other. The marksman would walk across the bodies of the executed to the next, who had meanwhile lain down, and shoot them. When the first massacres ended, the Germans even undermined the walls of the ravine to bury thousands of people under the soil, and it was said that 33,771 were slaughtered in 2 days at Babi Yar. The Nazis also stole the valuables and money of the victims, and much of the belongings were then given to resettled ethnic Germans inside of cities and towns nearby. Some were even buried alive, but around 100,000 residents of Kiev were slaughtered at the site during World War II, and the Nazis also made a concentration camp nearby. The Nazis were immensely proud of what they had done, and one of the commanders later claimed that, "We were driving past a long ravine. I noticed strange movements of the earth. Clumps of earth rose into the air, as if by their own propulsion, and there was smoke. It was like a low-toned volcano, as if there was a burning lava beneath the earth." Blurber laughed, made a gesture with his arm pointing back along the road and ahead all along the ravine of Babi Yar, and said, "Here lie my 30,000. But as the Second World War came to an end, there were a number of SS commanders who had overseen and planned the slaughter who were brought to trial. Paul Blobel himself was executed within the walls of Landsberg prison for his involvement with the Einsatzgruppe over the course of the war. But there was a hunt within the lands around Babi Yar to bring those men who had conducted the slaughter to justice. There were trials that took place, and one man, Boris Drachenfels, who was brought to the courtroom, explained what he saw, which horrified the courtroom. He said, "Screams of thousands of people were heard from far away. They stood surrounded by many policemen and awaited their fate. The policemen drove groups of people to the ditches, where they undressed. Special SD details and the policemen of our own battalion shot them at the nape of the neck. Adults were forced to lie down in the ditches and were shot, while children were torn away from their mothers and shot. Most of the shooters were drunk. People begged for mercy. Mothers begged us to spare their children." Drachenfels was sentenced to 15 years hard labour and was not executed, as he was said to have worked as a lookout and not someone who shot others. But there were, in January 1946, 15 former members of the German police force who had operated nearby who were brought to trial in Kiev to stand trial for their involvement in massacres and crimes during World War II. The courtroom was very busy, and of the 15 men who were tried, there were 12 who were sentenced to death. These men who were condemned were Fritz Beckenhoff, Karl Burkhardt, George Heinisch, Wilhelm Hellerforth, Hans Isenmann, Emil Jogschaft, Emil Noll, Willy Meyer, Paul von Scheer, Eckhard Hans von Schammer und Osten, George Truckenbrod, and Oskar Volisa. They had all been involved in the killing and massacre process inside of the Ukrainian lands, and in particularly Babi Yar, and they were on the 29th of January 1946 brought out for their executions inside of a town square in Kiev. The men who had been sentenced to death were brought out in front of the crowds of thousands, and many were stood on nearby hills to see what was happening. A huge gallows structure was made, and this was so large that all of the 12 could be executed at the same time. The men were led onto the back of trucks, and they were backed under the crossbeam of the gallows, and the men were approached by an executioner. He secured the noose around the necks of each of the men, and the death sentence was then read. It was said of this that, for the brutal destruction of peaceful Soviet citizens and prisoners of war, for the destruction of cities and villages, for the enslavement of the population of Soviet Ukraine, guided by Article 2 of the Criminal Code of the Ukraine SSR, the military tribunal sentenced Scheer, Burkhardt, Schammer, and Osten, Heinisch, Volisa, Truckenbrod, Gellerfort, Null, Beckenhoff, Isenmann, Jogschaft to death by hanging. Comrade Commandant, enforce the sentence. With this cry the trucks then drove off, and the 12 men were left hanging by their necks as they slowly strangled to death in front of the crowd. They struggled for breath, but within minutes they would be declared dead, as their bodies went limp and still. The men were all members of the former German police force who took part in horrific massacres during World War II, and they were all condemned for this in front of the huge crowd in public. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.